Can you now welcome to the stage, please, to share therapeutic input into caregiving and training, how critical it is. Please welcome to the stage clinical psychologists Andrea Lewis-Coker and Margarita Lally.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here today and for giving us a scope to go through what we think is really important. And just like to say a big thank you to Richie Barlow. He gave me permission to analyse his book, and that will be part of our presentation today. So thank you so much for that, and I hope I got it accurate. So some of the things, I suppose, my name is Margarita Lally, and I am a counselling psychologist and psychotherapist. I work in a medical practice in Dublin and in Kildare. I work closely with doctors for interventions and, I suppose, assessments and treatment plans. And I work with adults, teenagers and couples, you know. So I'd just like to point out that quite a lot of the times the issues we have in care are going on in more affluent areas as well, unfortunately. So I would see a lot of that behind the scenes as well, which I won't be discussing about today because that's not what that is about. But just to get you thinking that some of these issues about abuse can go on in many different areas, you know.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Andrea Lewis-Coker, counselling psychologist, and I currently work with residential homes supporting therapeutic input. So we'll go through the learning outcomes.
Yeah. So some of the things we want to look at today, I suppose, is a little bit around the antecedents of psychology onto the positive psychology movement, because we are looking at kind of solution focus. So we don't want to continue talking about disease models of psychology. The evolution of practice, the neuroplasticity, attachment, the approaches to psychological attunement. We then touch into Richie Barlow's and the analysis, and we've done a little table in terms of, I suppose, some of the psychological methods that Richie would have used internally to cope and survive the severe abuse. And then we kind of look as well at the table, we look at some of the system problems and, you know, for hope to kind of review that for change. We also have a little look, I suppose, about one of the main things in solutions that we were kind of focusing on was conscious practice. And I suppose it's gone into everything today, conscious parenting, conscious this, conscious that. And I suppose a huge part of conscious practice is all the professionals involved in children's lives is the movement of the unconscious to consciousness, because 95% of people's thoughts are unconscious, and everybody, every professional, everybody, every child needs to be guided to get that unconscious to the conscious level. So nobody's exempt from, I suppose, our own issues and our own past. We just need to be mindful of how we bring them into this work. One of the examples I give on that is around the lucifer effect, and I'll just touch base on that a little later in the presentation. A little bit into the structural brain and trauma-informed modalities, relational trauma and relational healing. And I suppose a little bit about, I suppose, how important Brené Brown, and I'm sure you're all familiar with her, how important her work is on vulnerability, that to connect to our own vulnerability as practitioners and help young people connect to their vulnerability is key. Because if we can teach them to sit with their emotions, they're less likely to split, which is where all the problems, like, I suppose, emerge. So trying to sit with that for an overall healthy well-being, because disconnecting from their vulnerabilities, you know, increases risk-taking behaviours and I suppose increases overall significant mental health problems. So they're the kind of things we're looking at. So I suppose one of the things that I just want to mention here is to seek to understand. So we all view the world through the lens of our own experiences. The key is to look beyond what we think, what we know, and what we have experienced, and try to understand things from another's point of view. Even the effort to empathise makes us more humane. So I'll go into a little bit more about the history of psychology. I suppose originally it was focused on the disease model, and that's over 60 years ago, where we would have had the diagnostic statistical manual. And even in Richie's stories, and he mentioned how hard it was for him to come out about his sexuality, and we look how far we've come, but like being gay was actually considered a disorder. And so we've come very far, and I suppose that's partly what I would believe that today is all about, is like bringing that some more steps further, because it is all about learning for everybody. We then look at the father of positive psychology, Martin Seligman, so 1942, and how he brought it to looking at things in a different way, in a lighter way, and understanding, I suppose, how much power we have over our own minds. We need to be as concerned with our strengths as with repairing damage. The good life is about striving to be good and ethical in all our actions. Meaningful life is about using your character and strengths in service to a larger good. Sean Aker is one of the more current positive psychologists, and I suppose one of his examples really resonates with me, because he would have talked about academia and how in our systems a lot of children are nearly encouraged to study in an isolated way. So, and this was part of his experience. But when he was in Harvard, he realised that he started to get a lot of low mood from studying on his own. And he would have thought that he was depressed at the time. So he heard a lot of noise outside his dorm, and there was a lot of laughing and giggling and play. And so he opened the door, and there was all his fellow students playing and joking naked. So it was very out of character for Sean Aker, because he wouldn't have been that mad or of a risk taker, but he thought, do I study and stay isolated, or do I join in and connect? So he joined and connected, and it lifted his depression. And he thrived and was able to study more for the exams as a result of a connection. Now, I'm not encouraging you all to take your clothes off here today, but I'm just giving an example about the creativity and how important it is for play, you know. If we go on then a little bit to look at the evolution of practice, in neuroscience, the study of how the brain supports mental processes, the developmental psychopathology, the study of how adverse experience impacts the developing mind and brain. And I suppose adverse experiences and ACE is a huge part of the work with traumatised children. Interpersonal neurobiology, the study of how behaviour impacts the mindsets, emotions and biologies of those around us. So that is in relation to how we, I suppose, look at ourselves as practitioners, and how, you know, emotional regulation is key, so we can help young people co-regulate. Because how can we teach young people when we're struggling with emotional regulation ourselves? And sometimes we might have that in life, and sometimes we lose it. So it's always an ongoing, I suppose, learning for us to maintain emotional regulation for the work. And some of the key, I suppose, theorists in this area would be Kathy Steele, Bessel van der Kolk, Judith Herman, Janine Fisher and Alan Shore. And they've done Trojan work in the last 10 to 15 years, which has reinforced all the earlier theories of psychology and just shown that this is, you know, it's an actual physiology as well as our thoughts about what was happening in the human mind. Trauma robs you of the feeling that you're in charge of yourself. And I think that really came up in Richie and Alfie's stories today. Trauma produces physiological changes, recalibration of the brain alarm system, increases in stress hormone activity, alterations in the system that filters relevant information to irrelevant information. This is why people can continue to repeat the problem and have trouble learning. And I think sometimes with staff members, and certainly in my experience, because even though currently I'm not in that area, I would have had experience in residential work many, many years ago. And I think there was a lot of frustration with staff members not understanding why young people would repeat the same risk-taking behaviours. And, you know, so I think it's really important for everybody to understand why that is.
And today we hope that you will observe and be part of a conversation between myself and Margarita, where, you know, Margarita's already started to share about psychological theory and practice, and we can start to think about how that impacts on us in terms of changing our practice. So in terms of kind of my journey and how that began, my mum was a foster carer and I was an adult co-carer, and what I observed and was part of was really a lack of understanding from my mum as a carer about adverse life experiences, attachment, trauma, and why the children were behaving the way that they were behaving, and not realising that that was communication. And I suppose that led to a lot of frustration, distress, breakdown in placements, hopelessness on both parts. And so for me, it was about supporting all systems around understanding, you know, some of the theory and practice that Margarita has shared already this morning, and how we utilise that to change the way in which we care, the relationships that we develop. So we're going to think about that a little bit more throughout our presentation.
Yeah. So Connection. Our brains are wired to be part of a tribe. Most of our energy is spent connecting to others. Almost all suffering creates trouble in relationships or difficulty regulating arousal, enraged, disorganized, shut down, overexcited. Our problems interfere with engaging with our tribe. So I suppose, because it's affecting our physiology, I just want to go on to a diagram here. 2 seconds, apologies about this. There we go. If we can see the diagram there of the brain, this is the 3-tier structure. Paul MacLean in the 1960s. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but I'm going to go through it with you again today. So if we look at, I suppose, with the evolution of the brain, so we can understand these children's behaviours. So if we look at the red bit, that's the reptilian part of our brain. Some people call it the lizard part, just so they remember that part of the brain. And when we look at when we were cavemen and cavewomen, that part of the brain really served a purpose. So when cavemen and women got angry, they were able to release the adrenaline to go kill the animals so we could actually eat. So it was a survival mechanism. It's also where the fear and most of the stress responses are. So the fear kept us hypervigilant, so we were able to protect ourselves in those times from predators because we weren't able to go into our house and turn on the alarm. So it was a very different society. And that part of the brain is still there with us today, even though environments have changed an awful lot. And we do need it for some practical reasons in terms of oxygen to blood cells, which I won't bore you with. But if we look into the green part of that diagram, the prefrontal cortex, we're looking at mental health issues. And a lot of people ask me, why is there so many mental health issues today? And with evolution, that prefrontal cortex has evolved 3 times the size. So I suppose that's the control center. That's what, how we make decisions, how we reason, our logical part of the brain. We look at that part of the brain, we think about our young people. That part of the brain doesn't develop until, we're 25. And again, it brings up some issues around the legal system and young people, when they're 18 and particularly in care and they're kind of rushed on, you're old enough now. But psychologically, that part of the brain doesn't develop till you're 25. There's new research coming in to say there's even more developmental delay depending on the severity of trauma. So it's just keeping that in mind when we're working with each other and when we're working with these young people. So if we look at the orange bit, that's the limbic part of our system. And there's 2 things I want you to think about when we look at limbic. We look at the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is where we store our memories. And we know that an awful lot of young people's memories are stored in the semantic memory. So that's stored in our bodies. And I'm not sure if any of you had the experience where all of a sudden you see something or you see somebody and you get a nauseous feeling in your stomach. And it's a trigger because something has triggered you, bringing you back to a time where you were really uncomfortable. So it's actually felt in the body. And sometimes we can't make sense of that from the logical part of the brain, from the prefrontal cortex, but we feel it in our body and we know something's not right. So if we go over to the other side of the limbic system, we look at the amygdala. And in the amygdala, I suppose, that's our alarm system. And I explain this to people in terms of at home, you have an alarm system, a fire alarm system. So at home, if there's a fire, that's signaling you to, I suppose, get your fire blanket or your fire alarm or get your fire extinguisher and put out the fire. Or if that's not possible, ring the fire brigade and get out of the house and get everybody safe. In my house, quite often it goes off for burnt toast. And that's why I wanted to explain to you because, sometimes that amygdala is actually ringing in our brains because of burnt toast. And quite often with trauma, it's going off because of burnt toast, because of the triggers, not because the trauma is right in front of you. So I suppose we need to learn how to dampen that signal when it's not necessary. And if we look at anticipatory anxiety, that's another way that alarm just keeps going off. So there's 3 ways of managing this brain structure. And just give me a second now so I can go.
Whilst Margarita's going back, it's just about being mindful that we won't see these triggers. So we won't always know what these triggers are. So we have to think about, as Alfie was speaking, it was for me about the curiosity as to why somebody's behaving in that way or responding in that way, to just be, to not use our assumptions, to be curious and ask questions and to be with the child as to why that might be going on for them.
Yeah. So if we go into this neuroplasticity, and this is like fascinating research, again, in the last 10 to 15 years, to know what we can do about this now. So the top-down approach is talking and connecting, and I suppose that's a lot of what I do as a psychologist, is looking at things logically and being able to understand the person's world, connecting to the person, and it can be slow. And quite often I'd have to bring a lot of creative pieces into my work to connect to people, depending on their trauma histories. We look at the bottom-up approach, and I think this is one of the most important approaches when you're looking at young people in care, is the bottom-up approach is where we help them engage in experiences that deeply contradict the helplessness, rage, and collapse that result from trauma. So things like that would be, and obviously it would be individual, because horse riding would be very therapeutic, but if people hate horses, it's not going to be therapeutic for them. So it's trying to get the right activity to calm that reptilian brain so the stress response isn't kicked off as much. When we've worked on top-down and bottom-up approaches, the alternative then is the middle approach, and you know, some patients that I see would need support with SSRIs. So the SSRIs then dampen that alarm system so it's not going off and making a lot of noise. So when we manage our system, we've more ability to access the prefrontal cortex, and I suppose it reduces going down to that reptilian primitive behaviour. When we look at young people that are traumatised, it is the reptilian behaviour they're acting out of. It's the stress response, it's the fight, the flight, the fear, the fawn, and the cry response that they're engaging out of. And it is complex, and it is really hard to understand it, very hard to work with, especially when it's repeating all the time. But I suppose the creativity in understanding this can help us bring new ways of practicing.
And I suppose the key to both of those really is the connection, the attachment that's formed. So I could spend all day talking about attachment, but I'm just going to really summarise really what I focus on in terms of attachment training for staff teams, supporting them to think about the importance of the first 1,001 days and how all areas of development begins at that stage. So, you know, for staff teams, they might not realise, or individuals might not realise the importance of that relationship, and that their role models, you know, I always say it's not just something that is done to children, we're very much part of that process in terms of relating. And when, you know, one of the examples I use within training is the intersubjective relationship that Ian Wright talks about with one of his key teachers in terms of the relationship that was formed. This teacher was able to use a shared language to describe his anger. It was called the heebie-jeebies, and really gave him tasks and responsibilities. I don't know if anybody's seen the documentary, but it's really, really powerful about that key adult and what they meant. And obviously that happens within our homes. And I suppose when Alfie was talking this morning, I was thinking about that relationship, that connection, that sense of belonging that he got from the gang, and how we can ensure that that sense of belonging and that attachment relationship, that safety that comes from that relationship occurs within the home. So, you know, that's just kind of a summary thinking about how the importance of attachment and about educating carers around all systems to recognise that, you know, when those losses and separations happen, what is the impact for our children? Later on, we're going to invite you to engage in an experiential exercise that supports your thinking and helps you to maybe empathise about some of those moves, and to hopefully promote change in terms of your practice at all levels of that system.
Yeah. So in terms of attachment as well, we touch on to a bit of that when we analyse Richie Barlow's story. And I suppose when we look at the right hemisphere, it develops in the last trimester of the pregnancy, and then further develops in the first 2 years of life. Relational trauma and relational healing, and we're looking at attunement, and Alan Shore does a lot of work on that. So when we're looking at attunement and connection and creativity, I suppose play is so important. Stuart Brown was brought in America because of the Texas massacre, Tower massacre. He was brought in by the US to analyse, you know, the personality of the person that behaved in that way. And what he found was that there was an absence of play in childhood. There was also, I suppose, authoritarian approaches in the parenting styles and abuse history. So he went on to do 2 further massacre and analysis on that profile, and found very similar results. probably because of burnout, I'm not too sure, but he ended up turning into a play therapist instead of analysing the behaviours of people that turn out to behave in ways that are detrimental to others. So I think it's so important when we look, I suppose the play activates the cerebellum and that lights up, and we know that today. If we look at a lot of psychological attunement, Stephen Forbes does a lot in the polyvagal theory, and that's all about our emotional states and us as professionals managing our emotional states because they are contagious. And I think as a parent, I have a mother of 3, but if I go in and I have a stressed face, my children automatically pick up on it and they'll react to that. So I need to be mindful of that as a parent, and we need to be mindful of that, again, in conscious practicing in the roles that we have. So we need to be mindful, I suppose, of our tone of voice, of our the pitch of our voice, you know, and how we communicate. Our non-verbal is really important. Verbal is only 7% of communication. And just to give another example, I suppose, of the importance of play, Dr. Bruce Alexander in 1970 did an amazing experiment. And what he did was he put a rat into a cage, an isolated rat in a cage. And he put 2 water bottles. One water bottle had heroin and cocaine in it, and the other water bottle was just water. And I suppose because the rat was isolated and didn't have anything to do, he predominantly went for the water with the cocaine and the heroin. So after longer studies, they realised the rat did this until the rat died. They replicated this study and it was reinforced that the same thing happened. So then they put a rat into a cage with loads of playthings for the rat to do. They put other rats in the cage so they'd have company for connection. Put the 2 water bottles in, one with plain water and one with water with heroin and cocaine. And the rats barely touched the heroin and cocaine. So I suppose that research, I suppose, really reinforced how important it is for us to be creative with these young people, because it's the creativity that mitigates against them turning out, you know, to engaging in risk-taking behaviours and engaging in addictions. And we all know that prevention is much easier than cure, because when they do go past certain ages, it is harder to bring them back. It's not impossible, and we know that through neuroplasticity, but it is much harder to bring them back. So I think it's so important that we think about that as practitioners, you know.
And that takes us on to think about models of care in terms of therapeutic care, and using the PACE model, which is by Dan Hughes. So it's around playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. So, you know, we encourage, you know, just in terms of what Margarita was saying, in terms of, it's about a way of being, thinking about that playful nature, lightness in tone, and about us being children, getting to our inner child and really being able to lead that for children so that they feel safe enough to engage in that play. And so much can come out of that playful experience. And also, you know, being accepting of a child in that moment, you know, really accepting them for that moment. And, you know, just thinking about what Alfie was saying at that point, you know, he kept going back to those behaviours because there was no adult there to accept him where he was in that moment, and thinking about, you know, he used that word, kind of being a naughty child. And curiosity for me this morning, that's all I could think about when I was listening to Richie Miguel and Alfie speak, you know, the importance of us just suspending our assumptions and really just being curious and seeing the world through a child's eyes, you know, in terms of what we're focusing about today, not using our experience to maybe lead a child into terms of what they might have experienced, really wondering with a child, being with a child, you know, to be able to be curious about their experience. And empathy, you know, there's a fantastic video by Benny Brown around empathy versus sympathy, and, you know, how often we can go into sympathy and not stay with those difficult feelings and just be with somebody when we, you know, we need to show those feelings of empathy. So, you know, I think it's important that we think about that way of being. It's not just something that we are, you know, I suppose in the care home or with certain people. It's a way of being. It's the way we should be with all levels of that system. So I encourage you to think about that and how that can support change.
Yeah. So next we have, I suppose, the analysis. There's just a nice poem there, the analysis of Richie Barlow's experience. So this is the first part of the table. Can everyone see that? It looks quite small on my screen.
The next one.
Oh, it's the next. Okay, there. Does that come up? Yeah. So Yes, so thank you, Richie, for giving me permission to do this. I really appreciate it. So if we look at I suppose on the left-hand side, the surviving and thriving, I was looking at what was he doing internally? What was Richie's internal resources to actually get through the most severe trauma? And one of the things he discussed on page 11 was his imagination and his love for Madonna. So he used to listen to his Madonna music when he was in the height of it. And again, as Miguel kind of pointed out earlier, it's that rhythm, it's that internal kind of way of self-soothing and self-regulation. So even though Richie wasn't able to get it at those early days from external, he found it within himself. And I just think that that's absolutely phenomenal, Richie, and it's absolutely amazing that you were able to do that. The other thing he thought of was, on page 15, he kind of talks about one memory. I mean, we kind of think in our own lives how many times we go off on holidays, how many nice things we do. Richie thought of one memory with his grandparents when they brought him to Blackpool that he really enjoyed. And he replayed that memory to self-soothe and self-regulate in the height of trauma. And just think that was such an amazing internal resource, Richie, you know, amazing. When we look then, if we just jump over to the right-hand side, the systemic issues. At a very early age, Richie was also able to identify that his mum, and Richie, if you're finding this really hard, if you can mention, and I can move forward if you're finding it too hard. But he talks about his mum splitting. So there was an example he gave on page 3, and he had known that his mother, her non-verbal was very aggressive, she was very abusive, and this was his experience of her. A neighbour called in, and she became very calm and, very soothing voice and a very kind way of being. So at a very early age, Richie could see that she was, I suppose, splitting. And that was an amazing skill for such a young person to be able to figure it out. So while Richie was able to do that, there's many young people that mightn't fully understand what they're supposed to be caregivers and people in their families are supposed to do. And if they're not doing that, that is a problem. He also talks about, I suppose, on page 4 and 34 in one of the homes that you were in, Richie, he talked about a real want to show mum your room. And I think you'd done some art or something in the room, and she'd come to the care home, and you'd wanted to bring her up, you were drawn to that affection. But then the other part of your brain was saying, but she's not an affectionate mum, she's an abusive mum. So there's this real torn, internal torn. And at a young age, again, you were able to understand trauma bond. And I think this is such an important thing as professionals that we need to understand is trauma bond, that even when kids are abused, they're still drawn to the people that have abused them, which make it so much harder for us to work with them. But that is what's going on psychologically.
And I think when we think about what's going on for our children in the homes and in terms of, when we're thinking about today and how to, communicate and share what we want to in terms of psychological theory and knowledge, often I sit with staff teams where we're reflecting on why are children recreating those experiences. That's the only experience they know, and it's our role to give them an alternative experience. And that can sometimes be hard for us to see them going back again and again to that situation, but I suppose it's the consistency, the availability of us being able to be safe, regulated adults to support them when they do come back, to help them understand and make sense of that experience and make sense of themselves, other people and the world, providing that commentary that we often do to a younger toddler in terms of supporting them to make sense. But actually we need to do that for all our children. And I suppose it brings me on to thinking about the ages and stages of development and how important that is for, I'm continuously talking about that in consultations with team in terms of we might be presented with a 15, 16-year-old physically, but actually in terms of their emotional and developmental age, we very much might be seeing a toddler. And is that reflected in the care that we provided? Is that reflected in the interaction, our language, our way of being with that child? We really need to be able to think about what need do I need to meet in that toddler, that 3, 4, 9-year-old? How do I need to change my way of being to support their development and their needs?
Yeah. So I suppose if we just go on to we're going to go on to the next one here. And on the left-hand side there, we have attitude. And again, this is just so profound that Richie commented on page 166 that the only way to beat them is to end up with a decent life, being a good person. And I just thought that was the most amazing thing in the book. When I started reading Richie's book, I couldn't put it down, so it was literally cover to cover. So I suppose when I kind of think about that, I think about Viktor Frankl, and I'm not sure if people are familiar with Viktor Frankl's work, but Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp, and he had severe beatings and starvation and just severely tortured, and watched many people die. So from his experiences, he developed one of many theories of psychology called logotherapy. And in it, he describes the attitude, that we have freedom to have an attitude that one adopts to suffering. And when I read that part, Richie, it was just really reminded me of Viktor Frankl's ability to be able to get through his suffering, was the attitude he adopted to his suffering. There's some other things, I suppose, as well. We'll just go back to the relational healing. So relational healing, we're looking at some of Richie's experiences, I suppose, was with certain members of staff, Gary, Rose, Anna, I think the therapist, and Pauline. And with Anna, he felt a sense of belonging, and even with her wider family, that just felt so accepted. When we look at Pauline, I remember in the story he talked, because touch to Richie was not comfortable. So at first, when Pauline touched his hand gently, he felt it was different, it was warm, but he still questioned, am I right? Because touch to me is not comfortable. So, it took him time, even for the good people that he had met along the way, to develop that internal trust after all his experiences. So I think you were going to say a little bit about that, weren't
just
you?
in terms of us, in terms of staff teams, individuals, thinking about the way of being, and the kind of, again, it goes back to kind of the non-verbal, thinking about, some of the behaviours that we might find ourselves into in terms of, spending more time in the office, or feeling quite anxious or fearful of coming into work, and just being really mindful of what might be going on for you and how that might impact upon the relationship that you've got. Margarita's talking about reaching that relational healing. If you're not open to that child, and if you're not able to make them feel safe, how can that relational healing occur? We really need to think about, maybe we might have experienced secondary trauma, and from incidents that have happened, repeated incidents, and so that might be having an impact upon our openness to care for a child. So utilising supervision and reflective practice to think about what's going on for us, so that we're not going into block care, but we're more open to using relationships to heal.
And that was kind of another point, I suppose, of Viktor Frankl's, is that, one of the things was finding that connection and acceptance and loving somebody. If we just go back onto the other slide again, and we look over to the right-hand side. So these were some of the things of the system that I'd found in the book. So non-verbal abuse. So in one of the page 32, as far as I remember, Richie, it was you that saw a staff member, probably out of frustration and confusion and stress and being overwhelmed and maybe lack of education, mimicked them wanting to strangle a child. And Richie had viewed that, and it caused him a lot of distress. There was another thing that he mentioned in terms of staff hiding in the office, and that happened quite. So it was just kind of this, them versus us approach, which when I did work in residential, I would have heard a lot that, they were the experts and we're just so it's trying to come together with this, we're all on the same page, we're human as well. We've all gone through stuff. So the kids can feel that we understand them a bit more, because when we lock ourselves in offices and they get those experiences, they're just feeling worthless. Yeah. And, and they were some of the things.
Their thoughts about themselves or the people in the world, and that adults can't be trusted, adults can't look after me. And it's thinking about your behaviour and how that is experienced by the child.
We can also look there, the staff had no insight into trauma responsive behaviours, and that's one of the points that myself and Andrea are kind of trying to make here today, is just that it's so important that staff are more trauma informed. And, well, anybody actually working with children are more trauma informed. One of the staff members had made judgments. You're renting yourself out again was one of them on page 96. And I can't imagine how that felt with what was going on for you to have that comment thrown out there. So again, you know, the verbal is 7%, but it's also very damaging when we say things like that as professionals. So again, that's lack of insight and lack of understanding. It's not to, you know, put down what's happened, but look towards solutions to how we manage this moving forward. I think you had mentioned earlier about, you know, some staff members would talk about attention-seeking behaviour, but really they're looking at attachment-seeking. And so, you know, the attention-seeking is kind of nearly like child blaming, as if there's something wrong with them, you know.
Really recognising about the needs that child might be trying to get us to meet. So, you know, like Margarita says, you know, I often talk about attachment-seeking as opposed to attention-seeking, and we respond to it in a completely different way if we understand it from an attachment perspective.
So if we just go on here, I suppose that is just kind of showing what I was saying about it's 95% of our thoughts are unconscious and 5% are conscious. So this is all about conscious practice and what do we do to get our unconscious thoughts into a conscious level. So I suppose it's engaging in more kind of reflective work to bring that self-awareness to the forefront so we understand what we're bringing to the table. Because we do all have our own histories. Some of us have worked on them, some of us haven't. I know personally, because I've had to work on it, but I would voluntarily go back because I quite enjoy therapy. But it's just something that we need to be mindful of practitioners. The conscious mind determines our actions and choices. The unconscious mind determines the reactions, and the reactions are just as important as the actions. So that brings us into introspection. So the first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself. To conquer yourself is to conquer all things most shameful and vile. And that goes back as far as Plato. Out of our vulnerability will come your strength. And that's kind of Freud's work. It is not the mountain we conquer, it is ourselves. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else.
And I think that for me, in terms of change, I think it's about thinking at every system and think, you know, as psychologists, we are encouraged to engage in peer supervision, individual supervision. You know, ask yourselves, you know, where does reflective practice and reflective supervision sit within your organisations and in your practice? How can you use introspection to make change?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I just want to explain a little bit about the lucifer effect. Just supports how key it is for us all to kind of support each other. So the lucifer effect, Zimbardo is a social psychologist, and he was brought in by the US to discover or to analyse the possibility of abuse going on in a prison. And there was a whistleblower, and he had got some information from the whistleblower. He looked through the footage. There was severe abuse going on from the wardens to the prisoners. Severe. It's the imagery. You can get it on the internet if you want to look, but I actually wouldn't even put it on the slides. It's so shocking. So Zimbardo, as a social psychologist, did all of that work and has all the background. So he went on then and he did the lucifer effect. So the lucifer effect is he recreated a Milgram, a fellow college student experiment of the Stanford experiment. So the Stanford experiment, he recruited 1,000 people to participate in this experiment. So he got 500 of those people. Now, all of them were kind of very similar. There was no discrepancies between the 1,000 participants. So 500 of them were wardens and 500 of them were prisoners. And they were given instructions to say that, you know, when the prisoners behaved in certain behaviours, give them little electric shocks, like 15 volts or whatever. And but the power went to their head, and after a couple of days, the prison wardens were giving them 450 volt shocks to the prisoners. This experiment was supposed to go on for 14 days, and a lady, Christina Maslik, shut it down. This experiment happened in 1971, but she shut it down. And I suppose the reason why I think this experiment is really important for us all to think about is he was a social psychologist. He had called out abuse in another situation. And because he was in this situation, he didn't see it himself. There was no intent. There was no malice. He just didn't see it himself. So he needed another professional to call it out. He actually thanked her quite a lot because he married her a year later. But so I suppose ordinary, average, or even good people can become perpetrators of diabolical acts of evil, and it's just something for us all to think about. I mean, we're very fascinated with the concept of evil. There's 136 million hits on YouTube about evil, and the line between good and bad, good and evil, cuts through the heart of every human being. I want to give you an example now of the conscious and the unconscious, and this really hit home to me. So this man, Henry Hayes, had killed a 16-year-old black boy, and he was put in prison for it, and he was put onto death row. So on death row, he was put in a cell with a black man, and he started to talk to the black man, and he started to think to himself, he's nice. And then he asked himself and became curious, why do I not like black people? And he was part, his wider family were part of the Ku Klux Klan and his environment and his social environment. But because he didn't question where his thoughts came from, and it took him till his last days of his life to get his unconscious to the consciousness. I just want you to all think about that, because I think in different levels, now not to the same level, but we're all guilty of that. We're all guilty of behaving in ways where we're acting out of our unconscious that really, on reflection, we wouldn't be happy with ourselves. And they're coming from, I suppose, intergenerational traumas. Sometimes it's a bit of epigenetics, but we, through neuroplasticity, have the ability to rewire our brains, and we know this now. So why can't we just be more curious and ask ourselves those questions and be open to our own vulnerabilities if we make mistakes as practitioners? Because we're all just human as well, trying to figure this out together. So to avoid the lucifer effect, it is important to be mindful of our own context, feelings and circumstances, to focus on learning from experiences, to pay attention to manipulative factors that may lead you astray, take personal responsibility, align yourself with your values, ethics, morals and beliefs. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Edmund Burke. And Richie, you really kind of highlighted that today, was, they might have been good people, but they did nothing. And that is considered just as abusive when people don't call it out. Remember, it is our own individual actions that shape the world that we live in.
Just going to do the people mover and then we'll move on because I'm just conscious of time.
Okay.
So just as we're getting the slides ready, we're just going to do a 5-minute experimental exercise. So I'm just going to have a trigger warning here. If anybody doesn't want to engage in the exercise, you're more than free to just observe, or you can take yourself out of the room for 5 minutes just whilst go through this exercise. It's something that we do in attachment training, just to support you thinking about the moves and the losses and the separations, okay? So there should be sheets on your table if you want to make a note of your responses to the people mover exercise. So I'm very conscious of time, so I am just going to go through these, but if you can just fill them out if you feel able to. If you don't, like I said, you can just observe. I am going to direct the questions to Margarita just so that you can observe what the process might look like, okay? So you can either think about, in training I often get people to think about historical, taking them back to 8, 9 or 10, but I'm just going to ask Marguerite to think about the here and now and think about her life and her home as it is. So I want you to think about your home and your life there. And I want you to write down what you like best about your home and your life. This could be anything that comes to mind. People, rooms, wallpaper, neighbours, anything that comes to mind. I want you then to write down what you don't like. So taking yourself back to either the here and now in your life and what you like and that you don't like, or to a specific age when you're a little bit younger. I want you to imagine that there's a knock at the door. You open the door and you're standing there, and the people mover is there. The people mover is someone with the authority and ability to move people from one home to another. The people mover does this whenever someone is unhappy in their home. The people mover tells you that you're going to be leaving today to live with a new family in a new home. The new family and home will be better for you, and they are certain they can make you happy. How do you feel? What are you going to pack? You can take one backpack with you, no animals or pets. What's going into your bag? As you walk away, turn and look at the faces of your family. Who can you see? What are their faces saying? What would they say if you gave them a voice? You're driving away with the people mover. You're angry, but afraid to ask anything. The people mover talks to you, but you're too upset to listen. You ride in silence. How do you feel? You're in a strange street that you've never seen before. You stop at a house, you get out of the car. The people mover knocks on the door. How do you feel? The front door opens. There are new carers or adults standing there. They're happy that you've come because they want you to be part of their family. They're smiling and they're sure they can make you happy. How do you feel? The people mover is about to leave. The people mover says that you can never return home again, and any contact between you and your family must be made through the people mover. How do you feel? Perhaps you don't believe that this situation is happening to you, or perhaps you think, no problem, my family will not let this happen, they'll come and get me. Perhaps you're angry with the people mover, or the people in your new home. Perhaps you're angry with yourself. Maybe you're worried about whether you will ever see your family again. Maybe you were really unhappy in your home and now relieved to make this change, but you're probably concerned about the people left behind, so you may feel guilty or ambivalent. Whatever you're feeling, you're here now. As you sit here today, you're safe and in control of your own situation. You can focus on the needs of children who have lived through this people mover exercise. Dozens of children will have experienced separation from their families of origin and placement into foster and residential care. And there's 2 points that I want you to consider. No matter how skilled and caring the social worker who has moved the child to your home, it is possible that the child experienced it as the people mover. The child in your care has had previous moves and separations, and each move will trigger a memory of the previous move, separation or loss. Consider what impact this may have on the experience of their core beliefs about themselves, other people, and the world. How we may behave or act following this experience. How would you want others to respond? So just wanted to do that exercise really to just get you to think about yourselves and, really empathise with that situation and think about how we might change that process, especially when we find children are often moved when they are making good progress and development, and we decide that actually we want to move them to somewhere else that might be a bit cheaper. What impact does that have on their core beliefs about themselves, other people and the world, and change?
So I suppose even when Andrea was going through that, I was thinking briefly about my own experiences and bringing me back to 9 or 10 and all of those questions about how I felt. Everything was funny. I had no language around emotions. Everything was just funny. Took me 9 years of studying human behaviour, probably 6 years in therapy before I could actually name how I felt. So I really understand when children are using their behaviours, to, I suppose, to show us how they're feeling. They don't have the capacity for the words. They're not operating out of the prefrontal. It's our job to teach them how to get to that point. If we just look at that slide quickly now, and I know we're nearly finished, this slide shows at the very top you've got going on with normal life, part of the personality, and the traumatised part of the personality. So everybody here may understand this, even as professionals, that sometimes we go on with normal life and everything's fine, but in the background we've had an experience in our own childhood that's still niggling there, and if certain things come up, we're triggered. So the traumatized part of the personality, that's where splitting happens, the fight, the flight, the fear, the freeze and the cry for help response. You can see some of the neuroses and psychoses that develop as a result of severe splitting. I won't go into them all because it's too time consuming. But when I'm working with a patient, I can kind of see where they're at and try to help them with the reintegration process. So there's a lot of controversy off that. I know initially people would be familiar probably with multiple personality disorder, which is more common now. It's DID, dissociative identity disorder. And there was a lot of controversy over the multiple personality. But it's kind of a similar concept that we need to help to reintegrate. With the kids, when we get them into care or whatever way we're working with them, if we sit with their emotions, it reduces splitting. So again, it's about prevention as much as we can, instead of going back to the cure, because it is harder. It's not impossible, but it is harder to deal with traumatized adults and to do this reintegration than it is to catch them when they're young. And we all have those opportunities of catching them when they're young, and blessed to have those opportunities of catching them when they're young.
Absolutely. So I'm just really conscious that we're going over time, but just in terms of summary, in terms of what we expect or what we would hope in terms of the whole system, not just within the homes, but the whole system, to really think about safety, stabilisation and engagement. We're not going to go through all of those because we are completely out of time, but we thank you very much for taking the time to listen to us today.
Thank you.